All right, well, it is 7, and I think I'm gonna start, and people can just trickle in as they come in. So I want to thank you guys for coming to our program today, commemorating the author Ernest Hemingway. Before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. We're going to start with the presentation, so if everybody could mute their microphones, that would be great, unless a question is asked, and then you can unmute. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll open it up for discussion. Okay, so with that said, let me introduce both of our guest speakers and co-moderators, Dr. Deborah Mix and Dr. Rai Peterson. Both teach in the English department at Ball State University. Dr. Mix teaches classes centering on avant-garde writers, ethnic literature, and 20th century American literature. She is also the co-editor of Approaches to Teaching the Works of Gertrude Stein and the author of A Vocabulary of Thinking, Gertrude Stein and Contemporary North American Women's Experimental Writing. Her research focuses on experimental writing, especially poetry. Dr. Peterson teaches classes on modernism, poetics, pedagogy, I might have mispronounced that, sorry, American literature, queer theory, and book arts. Her research focuses on American writers between the world wars, and she is currently writing a biography on Solita Solano. Because of immersive learning projects through Ball State, she also writes about Kurt Vonnegut and Sylvia Plath. Last but not least, she secures grant funding for the Book Arts Collaborative, a community letterpress and hand-sewn bookbinding facility in the Mad Jacks building in downtown Muncie. So without further ado, I will hand things over to Dr. Deborah Mix and Dr. Rai Peterson.
Well, I'll just add my thanks to Alexis's and say thank you all for coming. I think Rai and I are not envisioning something super formal here, so please pipe up if you have questions or just want to jump into what we're saying. We're, I think, hoping for something kind of organic here tonight. So we'll try not to get too bogged down in details as we're sort of setting things up, but if you want more information, we would be more than happy to fill in some gaps.
Yeah, I would second that and say jump in anytime you have a question. There's a fairly small number of people here, and we'd be happy to have this as a conversation. So,
absolutely.
Yeah. These are some people chopping down trees in Michigan.
They look so natural and free. The guy with the axe.
Yeah. I don't think he took that great big hack out of that tree with that little axe. No. It's my theory. So we thought perhaps some of the people who came tonight would have seen the recent Ken Burns, Lynn Novak biography of Hemingway. If you watch that PBS special in the last month, we mostly agree with it, but it's a little bit superficial, and it follows my mother's edict: if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. So they avoided some things about Hemingway's life that are harder truths.
So the book we're talking about tonight, In Our Time, was published in 1925, and we'll get to a little more about that in a minute, but we wanted to give you a little context for Hemingway himself up to that point. So this is really just a biography of his early years. He was born and raised in Oak Park, Illinois, to an affluent family. His father was a doctor, and he was one of 6 children and the oldest son in the family. He was eager to join the Army during the First World War, but he wasn't able to enlist, so volunteered as an ambulance driver, and some of you all may know that part of his story. He was injured pretty quickly after he arrived in Europe and sent home, where he was understood to be a decorated war hero. And there's sort of some different takes on the degree to which maybe he played up that story or allowed people to think what they wanted to think about it. But by 1921, he was married, and he and his wife, his first of 4 wives, Hadley, Richardson, they moved to Paris, and he was working as a newspaper writer. And Mike, you had mentioned his training as a newsman as being maybe part of what's going on with his style. And while he's in Paris, he joins a community of other expatriate Americans, including F. Scott Fitzgerald, Sylvia Beach, and Gertrude Stein herself. And I think that's the other place that Rai Peterson and I would point to as a really important influence on his style.
I think an interesting thing is how much we owe this book to Hadley Richardson, because Hemingway was away from home, and I forget where he was right now, Italy, and he met an influential editor there who said that he would be interested in seeing some of his work, and so he relayed that information to Hadley, and when she was joining him, she put all of his drafts that she could find around their apartment in a valise. And it was she either lost it on the train or it was stolen from her, and it was never recovered. So I think it was Pound who said to Hemingway, "Don't worry, you're only out the time it took you to write them. If you wrote them, you can just write them again." But you know, between the first writing of these autobiographical stories and the second writing, he had all of that exposure to Fitzgerald and Sylvia Beach and Gertrude Stein, and it probably changed his style a great deal. Maybe some of you have had this experience where you write a document on your computer and it auto saves, but you don't know what name it's under and you think it's lost forever. And so you recreate it and you think the whole time you're recreating it, oh, this replacement document isn't as good as that vaunted document that was lost. It's terrible. But I've occasionally had that happen and then found the lost one and discovered that the newer one was better. So I think in this case, we can assume that this book is better because Hadley lost those first drafts, yeah. But that might be a stretch.
So this book comes out in a moment, right, where of enormous change. And if you think about what's happening at the turn of the 20th century in those first years, right, everything is speeding up, getting bigger, changing the ways that people communicate and talk to each other, right? So we have right, new technologies and new materials that are allowing cities to grow up, right, with skyscrapers through things like reinforced concrete, plate glass, but also to grow out, right, because cars, planes are allowing for more mobility, more travel. So people are moving and occupying space in different ways. And of course, they're connected by new media, right? Some of these are inventions of the 19th century, but that are becoming dominant technologies as we move into the 20th century, right? The film, typewriters, telephones, radios. And so there's some really interesting things happening in terms of both things being the same in many places, right? So there might just be one movie that's playing in multiple theaters across the country. And so you might be able to go to the movies, see it, talk on the telephone to a friend who had also just seen the same movie, or write about it in a letter. So that sense of distance and connection are really in flux, I think, in the early 20th century, in the sense of time, right? We also have new power sources and new scale of things, right? So in addition to those skyscrapers, things like a world war, right? Or the assembly line, that's another kind of standardizing of technology, right? There can be many of the same thing rolling off that same line. And you might think about the ways that it changes the way people work, right? So we have things like Taylorism, which is a sort of focus on efficiency, right? That says, right, what's the best way for me to move this thing I'm making on the assembly line from this point to this point? How can where should the piece I'm adding be kept to allow me to add that part to the shoe that I'm helping to assemble, or the car. And of course, right, as we move right into the 20s, we've had two enormous world-changing moments of mass death, right? We've had a world war and we've had the flu pandemic. And so I think as we move into the 20s, a lot of times we talk about the 20s as this moment of release, right? We have this kind of jazz age idea and the flappers and all the busyness and the fun, but I think it's really important to connect that also to all the losses that happen at the end of the previous decade, right? We have new ideas, right? So Freud is saying what you think you know about yourself isn't your whole self, right? That you have this thing called an unconscious that is sort of giving you, working in ways that you don't even recognize. We have Einstein and Heisenberg telling us new things about science, right? The principles of relativity, of uncertainty, right? That we can understand many things, but some things are going to continue to escape us. We have somebody like Alan Locke, who is thinking about the new Negro, right? And what kind of race relationships are we going to have as we move into the 20s? The figure of the new woman, right? What's going to happen as women start to move in new ways into the workforce, and as they take advantage of some of these technologies of mobility and communication, right? And there's a sense too that there's new aesthetics that are necessary to speak to those things, right? New forms of art, of writing, of thinking about the ways people are going to relate to each other. So there's this tremendous moment of change and innovation. And I think, you know, one of the things that I always think about is how fast all of those things are happening, right? In those first couple of decades of the 20th century, that we go from having none of these things to having all of these things that I think we now take for granted, right?
So, I'm sure that a lot of people are thinking about how the first couple of decades of the 21st century have been very similar. That we have electric cars, we have SpaceX, we have Space Force, we have this new video telephone that we were told would come around when we were children. And now here we are holding this meeting, all of us from our own homes via this invisible internet. That we have new power sources in terms of the renewable energies that we're pursuing and electric cars and that sort of thing. We have a new pandemic. We have tons of new ideas around us. We have a reconsideration of gender, a reconsideration of race. Which either argues that these issues are always with us, or it argues that around the turn of a century, we sort of go through the same kinds of issues again and again. It's kind of Groundhog Day.
Yeah. So this is Hemingway's passport picture from when he travels to Europe that first time. But I think for me, thinking about this book that is published in 1925, sort of, I want to think about all the other things that are that come out in this moment. So here's a brief list of fiction that comes out at this time, and we were talking a little bit about The Great Gatsby earlier as one of Alexis's most favorite books, I know. But also, right, some of you might know Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, right, which gets made into a movie with Marilyn Monroe about, I don't know what, 30 years after, maybe in the early to mid 50s, right? But it's actually a novel from a huge bestseller, I would also add, from 1925. We have, right, collections of poetry and plays that are watershed moments, and then the New Yorker magazine that's still with us begins its publication. So we have this, I think, this real moment in U.S. arts and letters, right, where there's this incredible output of creative work by American authors that Hemingway is participating in.
A thing that I'm struck about in looking at that list of fiction, though, is the sort of the notion of the grand chronological narrative and how that still holds sway aesthetically among people who are considered good writers of the time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like The Professor's House, which starts when its main character is in high school and ends with his death as an old man, and The Making of Americans, which, you know, covers several generations of a family. So In Our Time is kind of interesting because it's more fragmented
Mm-hmm.
than these other texts.
Yeah. I mean, it's right. D.H. Lawrence goes on to call it a novel, a fragmentary novel, or a novel in fragments, something like that, right? So Hemingway is participating in this kind of aesthetic experiment by doing something quite different himself. We wanted to talk just a bit about its odd publication, or not odd, but its very particular publication history. So Ray already mentioned Ezra Pound, who was a poet and editor, had solicited some short pieces from Hemingway in 1923. And so you can see on the left, the little review is the the publication that Ezra Pound and Margaret Anderson were putting out, and he is the he's the lead author there. The selections from In Our Time, but he is there with a lot of writers that I think now we understand to be really major figures in Anglo-American modernism, right? So Gertrude Stein, Mina Loy, E.E. Cummings, H.D., Dorothy Shakespeare. So he's in good company there, right? So there we have the 6 vignettes, so 6 of those little short pieces are initially published in the Little Review. And then the following year, someone who knows him asks, like, well, I'd like to put something out, right? So he adds 12 more of those vignettes, and the 18 of them are published together here in this edition. And I think, right, there's something interesting going on if you can kind of peer closely at the cover there. It's all like snippets of newspapers, Spanish, English, French, maybe German, also newspapers, right? So there's this sense that Hemingway is sort of reporting to us, right? So once again, we're sort of seeing this journalistic kind of lens being put around what he's up to.
Yeah, I think some of you might know this, but the Little Review was founded by Margaret Anderson, who was actually born in Anderson, Indiana, and grew up in Indianapolis. And so there's a local connection to this story. The vignettes, the pieces that this book began with, are the pieces that I find in teaching the book, the things that the students gloss over and don't pay that much attention to. In fact, I think of those vignettes as sort of interstices, just little kind of little acts in front of the curtain. And the things that are really the most intriguing about this book are the longer pieces, the pieces that were added later.
But right here, it is those vignettes that now I think we have a different opinion of, that are actually the thing that lets him start building the reputation that leads to the book itself, which is published in 1925. So this is a copy of that edition, and you can see some of the blurbs on the cover, right? Waldo Frank, Sherwood Anderson are praising the book. He publishes it with Boney and Liveright, which is a big publisher of modernist literature. And then it's basically, this version from 1925 is the version we basically know, except for the addition of the very opening piece, on the key piece that begins it. And the book is incredibly well reviewed. I was looking at the review that it got in the New York Times, and honestly, they are just, I'm just going to read you the very beginning of it because it's such a rave review. So this is from October 1925. The reviewer writes, and these reviews are all anonymous at the time in the New York Times Book Review. Ernest Hemingway has a lean, pleasing, tough resilience. His language is fibrous and athletic, colloquial and fresh, hard and clean. His very prose seems to have an organic being of its own. Every syllable counts toward a stimulating, entrancing experience of magic. He looks out upon the world without prejudice or preconception and records with precision and economy and an almost terrifying immediacy exactly what he sees. His short stories, sketches, anecdotes, and epigrams are triumphs of sheer objectivity. So whoever this reviewer was loving Hemingway real hard, right? Like and this reviewer is not a triumph of economy and objectivity, right? But you can also see, I think, the sort of seeds of the Hemingway vision, right? All of this language that sort of sets him up as very manly, as very strong, as very clear and objective, right? That's the way people are talking about him sort of from the beginning, right? But although this book gets great reviews, F. Scott Fitzgerald reviews it, D.H. Lawrence talks about it, it doesn't really sell very well. Partly because he has a novel that comes out the next year that kind of steals the thunder. But he said the publisher didn't promote it properly. And, you know, I think this is still true. that short stories are just not as popular as novels with the reading public, right? So for a long time, people just didn't pay attention to this novel or this collection, this book.
May I ask a question? When you use the word objective, as I read and reread the book the second time, I noticed, there's like the relationship with Marjorie, there's no one shaming him. It's just he presents the scene, and in your mind, you come up with whatever thoughts you want about it. Is that what you mean by objective or non-objective? Or he presents things with words and sort of lets the reader do something, I guess.
I think part of his economy is that he doesn't use adjectives, and adjectives often tell us how to think. And he also doesn't attribute the speaker oftentimes in dialogue. So a lot of times to avoid saying he said, she said, he said, she said, authors say things like, he complained, he growled, he groused. And because we don't have any of that here, we have to judge how things are said by the way they're taken. Instead of being told how a thing is said, we have to look at how the respondent in the conversation replies to understand the tone of what's been said. So
I was going to say too, he doesn't describe, he doesn't describe action, but you feel the action.
He describes place.
You sense.
He describes place. When I think of economy now with him, since seeing that PBS special, and I had read some of his works before, but in reading this book, one time I had an assignment in freshman college English to write a descriptive story about cleaning a room. Okay? So when you say economy, that's what you say to a journalist. They have to have economy because they don't have volumes of words to use. And I can see now where he really is a journalist. He likes to describe situations, like the one on when Nick is fishing.
Mm-hmm.
That is an extremely descriptive scene, and the lures and everything. I mean, that would be, people who would read the paper would be interested in how you do something and, walk you through it. And that's my impression.
I agree. What's interesting about that story, though, Alice, is that we're never told why he's fishing. We get
right.
detail about the way.
Right, he leaves that, what Mike just said, he leaves that to the reader.
So one of the theories about Hemingway's work is that because he doesn't have that traditional exposition where he sets up the story with a lot of kind of false,
right,
just kind of making excuses to tell us things, like John came in, he's my cousin, right?
Right.
He doesn't give us that kind of thing. So as a reader, we feel sort of honored that we're not talked down to by the author.
Right.
But also we feel like we're in his club, like we're an insider. We don't have to be spoken to as someone who just arrived. Hemingway speaks to us like we understand already what happened in Nick in the past, and we don't have to be told that by the author.
And what would a journalist do? That's the same thing. They're not up or down, they're straight across. Describing the situation and what's going on.
I think too, this is just connecting to Ray's point about, right, he doesn't use a lot of those dialogue tags that we're used to seeing, right? She cried, she asked, any of those, right? The adjectives he does use are also like the really basic ones, right? Things are cold or big or hot or wet, right? They're not, we don't have a lot of other language. So I think maybe that's another way that is both journalistic in the way that you're talking about, Alice, but also that economical, right? And leaving a lot of space for the reader, as you were suggesting, Mike, too, to kind of fill in. What do we think, big in what way, or big in relationship to what, right? That's up to us to consider. And in that New York Times review I was reading from just a moment ago, there's a paragraph where the reviewer talks about the story The Cat in the Rain, and is sort of marveling at how nothing really happens in this story, right? There's a couple, they're in the room, the wife sees a cat, she wants to get the cat's gone, the hotel owner sends up a cat. And the reviewer sort of gives that summary and then is marveling, like, that's it. That, he said, this is from the review, that is absolutely all there is, yet a lifetime of discontent, of looking outside for some unknown fulfillment is compressed into the offhand recital, right? So there's not, right, we don't get inside her head of like, oh, she felt all of these things, or he felt all of these ways. It's just the kind of stripped down narrative that lets us do some of that work. So one of the things we thought we might want to talk about too are some different ways of thinking about this collection, right? So we just laid out for you here a couple of kind of the most common conversations you might find about In Our Time as a collection. So one connects it to Cubism, and right, so if what Cubism wants to do is to look at an object from all its angles, right, to try to give three-dimensionality on a two-dimensional picture plane, excuse me, then we might think about this as a Cubist text, right, that sort of makes things, puts things on a flat plane, but then at the same time gives us all this sense of depth that you all were just talking about, right? So that we have many different kinds of writing, right? The vignettes and the longer stories, right? And including the very long Big Two-Hearted River at the end. We have some characters that we see multiple times, like Nick, and others who just appear for one story, and then that's all we get, right? We might think about repeated themes or ideas, things that we see from more than one, in more than one moment, as another way of getting at Cubism, right? And then of course this question of perspective, right? What is it that these different characters think they see? How are they making sense of things? And how often do their different points of view maybe put them in conflict with each other, or just allow them to miss each other in those attempts at, I'm sorry, go ahead.
It's a 3-day blow.
Mm-hmm.
That, I thought, maybe when you were mentioning different dimensions, on the surface, these are two guys who are just going to drink.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But Nick is having second thoughts about Marjorie.
Mm-hmm.
And then he rationalizes, and I didn't notice Nick doing that in some of the other episodes. Nick, well, I could still see her in the end, and I hadn't seen, and that gave a different perspective, I guess, rather than just a flat, plane.
Yeah, that's the way that story's tied together with the end of something is always really intriguing to me, because what there's a story that we don't have in that, a kind of triptych of the story where Bill and Nick have planned Nick's breaking up with Marjorie, because Bill happens to be there waiting in the bushes. It's kind of creepy, and comes forward and says, like, was it terrible? Did she leave? Was it horrible? And then in the end, it seems to me that we learn in that the 3-day blow that Bill is more driving the breakup with Marjorie than Nick is.
Maybe he has an alternative motive himself.
Yeah, maybe it's not so fun when your best friend is more invested in his girlfriend than he is in you. Right?
Or maybe he's interested in Marjorie.
Well, yeah, or maybe he's interested in Nick.
Well, yes.
Yeah. Well, so we can come back to some of these perspectives, but Ray and I thought we would just lay out a couple of other possible kind of frameworks for thinking about the collection. So I'll let you take this one, Ray.
Okay, well, obviously there's a bunch of segments, and if you saw the Ken Burns film, you recognize those, of Hemingway's autobiography in here. First, it's his growing up in Chicago with, as Debbie said, his father, who's a physician. And interestingly, his mother gave private voice lessons and made more money for the family than her husband did as a physician. And so that is, you can see that that's a source of tension in the family, in the story, like in The Doctor and the Doctor's Wife, where everybody seems to be doubting the doctor, everybody doubts the physician, and you know, physicians make pronouncements and make decisions about people's lives. And in that case, we've got this wood that he's trying to either rescue or steal. And we've got a native person questioning him, worse than a native person, I guess, in the parlance of the time, a person who's half native, questioning the wisdom of the doctor. And then when he comes into the house, you know, and he's upset about it, his wife is just like, well, was he right? And so he retreats to his great masculine symbol of his gun. And that's kind of a strange story, actually. And then you've also got these war images, both the truth of what Hemingway knew about from the war. A lot of his war experience related in this book is written, it's secondhand. He's read about the war. But if you think about Krebs, right? Hemingway is in exactly the same position as Krebs in Soldier's Home, because you know, he finds that people don't want to hear about the war unless it's a story of his own heroism. And then, you know, I think Ken Burns covered this really well too, that after a while he had embellished or let people believe that he was so heroic in the war that it embarrassed him to talk about it, because you know, he gets trapped in his own lies. People want to hear those lies over and over again.
And then we might also think, and I think we're already leading towards this, right, that this is a book that's really trying to think about what it is to be a man, and a man in relationship to other men, a man in relationship to women, what it means to be a white man in relationship to Native men or to Black men in this moment. So lots of attempts to navigate the ways that race and gender are really in flux in some pretty powerful ways here in the first couple of decades of the 20th century, right? How do these different characters use their privilege or lose their privilege? What kinds of relationships do they seek to build with other people? So, these were kind of three lenses that Ray and I thought would be especially useful for our to have some conversations about this book, but I don't think it was our intention to limit us to these three lenses, but just to kind of give you a sense of some of the bigger conversations. And then we do have some discussion questions, but maybe before I skip ahead to that slide, I'll just pause here and see if there's I don't know, particular stories or ideas that you all wanted to talk about at this point before we move on, or if there's anything folks wanted to go back to, or other directions you wanted to go in.
I say, did anybody have a particularly favorite story, just out of curiosity?
I liked a lot of them, but I also liked the Big Two-Hearted River. And part of the reason is because I have fly fished, and
yeah, one of Ray's and my colleagues, a fiction writer named Sean Lovelace, he and I were talking about this, and Sean was saying he thinks Big Two-Hearted River is pretty much a perfect short story. Yeah. So you've got good company, Mike, in well, okay, liking that story especially well.
You know, one of the things about that story, now this is maybe just personal, but when you fly fish, nothing else is in your mind. You are constantly solving problems, the hook, the hatch, the fly line. And you might be on a stream for an hour and a half or 3.5 hours, and you look at your watch and you went, where did the 3 hours go? And I can tell, or I thought Hemingway, yeah, he certainly has fly fish because there wasn't anything else on Nick's mind.
But one of the things I like about those two stories that function in tandem is how Nick has to walk through the burned out forest to get to the lush forest. And so he has to, he's had to come through something. He's had to come through something devastating and tragic and dark to emerge at the end of that story in that contentment that he has.
The first time I saw Yellowstone, they had had a big fire about 2 years before. So I could identify with that. And I also could identify with Lake Superior. That area I know pretty well. So his descriptions of that, of Nick fly fishing, that was, it felt really true. A good observation on his part in describing it.
Debbie, do we still have that map slide in here? Aha. So that the picture on the left is the Hemingway cabin on Walloon Lake as it was around the time that Hemingway published this book. As often happens with family-owned lake property, this thing has been added on to and now it's a mansion. But this is what it was like then. And then you can see on this map where the red dot is, that's Leland, Michigan. That's a site that's really familiar to a lot of people in Muncie because it's where the Ball family's summer residences are. And that essentially Walloon Lake is right across Traverse Bay from there. I mean, it's a long drive, but you know, by boat, I guess from on the other side of that peninsula, it wouldn't be that far. And so it is, this isn't actually the Upper P, it's northern Michigan. But it's the Upper P isn't connected to this part, but it's just the extreme north part of this part of Michigan. So.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, you know,
sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I found those particular stories very soothing in comparison with all the violence in the book.
Right.
Well, there's such a domesticity to it, right? So he gets off the train, he takes this walk through the burnt out space, right? And it's very, it's physically challenging because it's hot and it's, you know, right? But when he finds his space, the thing he chooses to do is to make a little home for himself, right? To set up his tent, to cook the coffee the way that his buddy had taught him to do it, right? All of these things. And so I think there is a sense that that Nick himself is really seeking comfort and seeking to soothe himself, right? By what he chooses to do and not do, right? Whether that's the physical work of walking, fly fishing, making camp, and you know, when he feels ready to think and not think about what he's been through.
Mm-hmm.
There's a larger point about this that Debbie has made before, not in this conversation, but about the spheres of male domesticity in this book. Like the prize fighter story, right? That he's got the man who takes care of him and they essentially are a family. And he takes the risk of letting Nick in until it looks dangerous to Nick and then he sends him on his way, but he's the only one who can knock him out and soothe him and all of that. You've got the space in the 3 Day Blow, the cabin that Bill shares with his father. And then when Nick comes, he shares it with Nick. There's so much.
My old man too.
Yeah, my old man, the father with no wife who's raising the son. There's so much domesticity without women in it in this book. That's very interesting.
Yeah, and different models of care, right? That the heterosexual marriages are not going great, right? Those relationships that we see tensions between married couples, we see breakups, we see those kind of inabilities to communicate, but often among men, we see these really caring, loving, gentle, sometimes sad, but genuine relationships. So I think something really interesting is going on with that as well.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. and Mrs. Elliot too, we have that relationship between the wife and her friend, who things are so tense and terrible as they're trying to have a baby, although the wife is 40, which is old for that at this time. And then when her friend comes, they just lie in bed and have a wonderful time and are happy. That's interesting.
Well, we do have some questions that we might talk about. And I don't know if there's one here that maybe stands out to someone as one you'd like to chew on, or if there's something you'd like to go back to, or even thinking about, right, the one thing we haven't talked about are the bullfighting and some of the violent war scenes that we're seeing, or the execution. So there's plenty to talk about, but these are some starting places for us.
I say, just looking at that first one,
Mhm.
I know when I was reading the book, I had to read it a couple of times to actually get what was going on in terms of the violence, just because I think the language is so straightforward that I don't think it hits you right. Well, at least for me anyway. I don't know if anybody else had that experience.
I wonder if this is a place where those, the sort of low use of adjectives and the use of fairly stripped down adjectives contributes to that effect that you're talking about, Alexis, where it can sort of come at you without being, you know, right? If you think about what's actually being described, and even in that very opening on the quay at Smyrna, right, that kind of opening scene, right, it's shocking and brutal and awful, but I don't know that the language necessarily gives you that impression right away, right, even though you're dropped into the middle of it, right? They screamed every night at midnight. It's the first thing we hear.
And I had to go and I wanted to see like what, because I felt like he was referencing something. I didn't know enough about the First World War, and you know, this one, it was actually referencing something that I think happened in 1922, and Smyrna was basically, you know, our Rwanda, I guess is what I was reading. So, you know, it was just kind of horrific that that had happened.
Yeah, people in that attack were forced between burning and drowning. I mean, they were forced into the ocean by the burning of the shore. And there, I think in those vignettes, aren't there two? I read this book last week, and I think this is true, but I'm suddenly doubting myself. Aren't there two places where, in the midst of battles, women are giving birth? There is on the quay at Smyrna, but isn't there another one too where
The ending, the lady, the beginning story.
on the quay at Smyrna, that one, right?
An
Okay,
Indian
yeah.
camp, of course.
Oh yeah, and then, but isn't there another one of the? I think there is. There's a girl who's in labor, and some children are crowding around watching. So there is that. There's this kind of tension between.
I think it's the second little vignette. There was a woman having a kid with a young girl holding a blanket over her and crying, scared, sick, looking at it. Yeah.
So we've got this, and you know, the obvious juxtaposition of death and birth is in Indian camp, right? Where while the wife is giving birth to their child, the husband is dying from suicide in the bunk above. But he does this thing where in the middle of war, where men are killing one another, women are laboring to bring new life in. It's just an interesting, or either that, or it's so symbolic, overtly symbolic, that it gives you a frontal concussion, but it's hard to tell which. I want to say about the second question that my relationship with this book is about 50 years old. So about half of the life of this book, I have known it. And when I was introduced to this book as an undergraduate, it was a much different book to me than it is now. The Indian camp story, to me, was a story about the father's kind of heroism, how he goes out in a boat at night with no expectation of being paid or recompensed to deliver this baby that that is a tragic situation in the making. And when I read that story now, right, when the father says, you know, don't listen to her cries are immaterial, they don't matter to us, and his kind of prejudice against the Native Americans in the story, and his sort of foolishness for taking Nick along, and his there's that part where he says, like, he delivered the baby, and he does the sutures with some fishing line, some gut line, and that he sort of postures himself like a football player who's just won the game. That the father has no empathy for others at all. He's so hollow and horrible to me.
He was a bit egotistical.
Yeah.
You know. Yeah, he seemed very cold to the lady.
Mm-hmm. So I think a question I have about this is, like, we often say that a classic text is a text that has stood the test of time, and we tend to I think believe that means that book has meant the same thing all of that time, but of course it can't. And so if you just look at Indian Camp alone, this book has changed so much in the way its largely white audience from 1925 would have regarded it to the way we see it now. And I wonder if sort of the strength of a classic text in the making is that it touches on enough issues that whatever the issues are in the future, they're still supported, and we can still have discussions like this about those books. I don't know if I said that very clearly, but I'm saying, like,
no, I think that's what generation after generation can identify, because there's an aspect of still experiencing the same thing, maybe not in the same location and not certainly with the same people, but that same feeling that, and certainly today we have those same problems with the birth rates in this country of non-whites. So I think you're correct, and a classic it lives on because it's still relevant to people in this day and age, and it was relevant in that age.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's why Hemingway survives.
But I think too, part of what Ray was getting at, right, is that what we think of as the relevant details can shift over time, right? So that if in 1925 people were maybe read Indian Camp as a story of Dr. Adams's clarity and calm in a crisis, right? That he makes it through these, has one for the medical journals or whatever the awful thing is he says at the end, right? But that in 2021, right, we see the same story and read it quite differently and think, what on earth was that man doing, taking his son out there in the middle of the night? And what the heck is going on with Dr. Adams's brother handing out cigars and holding the woman down? And how, what is the doctor saying to his son at the end, right? His son has just watched a birth by cesarean section where the woman had no anesthesia. He's discovered the ostensible father dead, so he's been there for a suicide, and dad's like, well, those are the breaks. Right? That we we see those things so differently over time too, right? That it stands up to different kinds of readers, that it has something for us that's maybe different from what people found 100 years or almost 100 years ago.
I think in the early 20th century, people probably would have applauded Dr. Adams for his patience with Nick and the way he answers his questions and invites him to talk about what he's seen in the boat on the way back. Like such a indulgent and kind father who's teaching his son these life lessons. And, you know, now we read this and we think like, what was he thinking? Throwing that kid in a boat and taking him into a situation like this. You know, it was going to be, it was going to be a breech birth that had gone on for days. It wasn't going to be pretty. Why did he take him along? So
You call Child Protective Services for that now.
Yeah. Although I think, you know, by the end of the story, it does seem like Nick is feeling secure again, right? The last line of that story is, right, that he felt quite sure he would never die, right? That he, so I mean, I think all of these things can be true at once, right? That Nick himself maybe finds a moment of comfort or security in this, even as right, and that feels that to me feels like a thing that keeps happening throughout this book, right? Is that sort of crazy, desperate things happen, and somebody's in the middle of it trying to orient himself or to find some calm or some security, whether that's because they're cooking food for themselves, or that you've punched out the guy who is starting to become unhinged, or that you've you know, cast a perfect fly. That these characters are both in the middle of chaos and seeking that moment or that space of serenity or security.
After listening to some of the things that have been brought up in the last part of the Too Big Hearted River, I just thought, oh, it was a smart thing that he didn't go into the swamp. And now I'm wondering, is the swamp death, or is it symbolic?
or is it whatever has driven him out there alone? Is it what he's trying?
I mean,
yeah.
he's not going to go into the swamp to fish yet, or doesn't want to, and now I'm thinking, was that an omen that Hemingway was a non-objective kind of boogie situation?
Yeah, I think he's saying that Nick is, I always read that as a story about Nick trying to heal himself, trying to get some kind of restorative strength.
He wasn't ready. Yeah, I say he wasn't ready to go fish in the swamp yet.
But if you want to talk about omens, what's really weird about Indian Camp, of course, is that outside the boundaries of this book and the time that Hemingway wrote it, if Dr. Adams is modeled on Hemingway's father, which it seems he is, Hemingway's father died by suicide, and then so did Hemingway. Yeah. So that last line where Nick feels certain he'll never die, that just, when I read it now, I feel kind of creeped out by it.
There's a term used in a couple of stories, and I think it's dated, and I'm not sure, wedmage, or I forget the spelling. I was trying to look at, it's a term. What?
No, go ahead. Wedmage, the nickname they call one another.
Yes. What is that?
I think it's a nickname. I think it's just I don't know that it means anything. Did you Google?
I thought maybe it was a dated term back in the 20s. Okay.
I actually might be able to help here. I work on the Hemingway letters, and it is absolutely a nickname, but it's just kind of a permutation of his own name. It's just a nickname that Hemingway in his own life went by and signed letters with in his youth. But I was hoping, actually, when I unmuted, that I could jump us back just a moment to that really beautiful and generative conversation that you initiated, Ray, about that question number 2 and the kind of continual attention to this book. And I think so much of that has to do with what you were both talking about regarding domesticity and the sort of non-heteronormative, family structure, nuclear family relationships in the book. Because, Debbie, I loved your historical setup. I think all of those turning points of the early 20th century are so valuable for understanding pieces of the book. But what we keep coming back to, generations later, is thinking about those moments of, childbirth and relationships beginning and ending and pressuring against families and those kind of continual themes. And, you know, we're always constantly asking the questions like you just did, Mr. Flanagan, about Big Two-Hearted River, about those interior life moments. And I think part of what is so just astounding about this book is that we can do that historical connection, and we can say this is a connection to the technology of the time or the race relations of the time, but we can also just have that feeling of connection to it. It feels so immediate to us all this many, you know, generations later. So I just, to me, those moments of domesticity, stories like Soldier's Home, the tense moment with Krebs's mother around the table and his sister and talking about who loves whom, and those things are so incredibly powerful, and it doesn't matter how many years have passed since publication.
Krista, I just want to jump in and say thanks for coming tonight. And I was sort of surprised by the Ken Burns biography or film that Sandra Spanier wasn't interviewed on that, and you weren't, Linda Martin wasn't, Deborah Modelmog wasn't. They raised a lot of issues that are close to the criticism of those writers, of the work of those writers, but they didn't include them in the film. And I was shocked. I really tuned in expecting to see a lot of people that I know from the Hemingway Society, and I'm not sure where they got those people.
Yeah, I sort of couldn't agree more. I apologize. I'm tuning in from rural Indiana, and I don't have great internet, so I don't have my video on. But I was nodding furiously as you were saying that, and I think, you know, I was on a conversation just a couple of weeks ago that the Hemingway Society put together, and they asked Valerie Hemingway. Was on that call. Valerie Hemingway was married to Hemingway's youngest child. And she was on that call, and they said, why weren't you in the documentary? And, you know, she comes to all kinds of Hemingway events and conferences. She has great insights. And the documentary author, Jeffrey Ward, was there, and he was basically saying, we just had to make a lot of hard calls. We had to make a lot of cuts. We couldn't do everything we would have hoped to have done. And I thought that was kind of a sad answer, but I think they really focused in the documentary, and I'm curious what other people think about this too. They really focused on his legacy with authors and people who are, you know, writing, and how they were inspired by Hemingway or how they react to Hemingway, much more so than new insights into either the biography or the literary legacy.
Well, they kept gesturing at gender, but they didn't really follow up on it, except to talk about his hairstyles and his wife's hairstyles, which is a big part, you know, of the Garden of Eden. But I felt like they raised a lot. I felt like the Ken Burns film raised a lot of important issues in contemporary Hemingway scholarship, but then they didn't really delve into those. And maybe you can't. I mean, you know, the Michael Reynolds biography is what, 7 volumes? So, you know.
Right. Well, yeah, I was emailing with Deb Modelmog a couple weeks ago too after that event, and we were saying basically the same thing. It felt like they raised to the table issues that are now in the contemporary scholarly conversation, but they did not dig in deep. And, you know, it was like, here's the new stuff, but the new stuff was new 30 years ago, and we know about that stuff now, and we could actually maybe think a little harder about it instead of just saying, here's a thing you might not have heard before. I'm actually very curious if anyone else had that experience, especially thinking about sort of some of the questions on this list about Hemingway's newness or Hemingway's like place in time. I wonder if somebody who has lived in that biography less might have different perspectives about how the documentary handled it, or even how the stories in our time handle it. I don't know, maybe that was too convoluted of a question.
Do you want to reframe the question, Krista?
I'm just very curious. So I've been talking mostly to scholars about the documentary, and being disappointed with that thing that you just said, Ray, about the way that gender and gender fluidity was addressed in the documentary. So I'm curious about anyone, not, you know, anyone at all, if others had the same reaction, or if we are all just thinking it was fairly superficially handled.
I only saw the first part of the documentary, and it seemed very just autobiographical to me at that point, but I haven't seen the rest of it, so I can't really speak to the other parts of the documentary.
I think the problem is that he was bigger than life. So there's just so many stories about him. And so this documentary, I admire that they did it, but I think it was somewhat superficial, and really didn't. There's a couple of other books written that I think are parts of his life that are better, but you know, he's like you are all saying, he had a tremendous influence on writers for the next 100 years. And so I think that's, I think we deserve to understand a writer who can influence so many for so long. But unfortunately, because of all the suicides, that's really, when you mention Hemingway to somebody, that's the first thing they think of. And that's kind of a sad commentary on a man who had a style that was very different, and I think journalistically more, as I've gotten to know some of his works. So I hope someday somebody can do a more in-depth about his writings, and we'll see what happens. But I'm going to read the book again. This was the first time I read his short stories, these particular ones. The last book I read was The Movable Feast, which was published after he died. But I'm going to read it again because you've all given me good ideas. Thank you.
To me, I read this book again this week. I've read it numerous times, but I read it again this week thinking about this discussion and understanding that some of the people who would come to this would be people who have read Hemingway extensively. And I was really struck by what a blueprint this short little book is, 100-page book is, right, for the rest of his career. Like, I really see A Farewell to Arms in Soldier's Home, or in My Old Man, A Garden of Eden in Mr. and Mrs. Eliot, right? The Sun Also Rises in that chapter 13 piece. Like, I see him sort of almost like making notes to himself about things he wants to say about relationships and right, men and women and marriage and gender and a whole bunch of things that he later develops in full-length novels on those topics.
All right, I do want to say it is 8:02, so we should probably wrap things up. Did anybody have any like last minute questions or comments they wanted to add?
I'll just throw one last thing out there, since I haven't said anything, but as a skier, I really enjoyed the story with the skiing in it. Even with his sparse prose, I thought it was such a vivid description of skiing. I really was fantastic.
And of telemarking.
Yes, absolutely. The description of telemarking was actually, it was striking to me. You know, that's back, in the 20s, whenever this was written. 25, was it? So
right.
Yeah. No, it was just fantastic.
I think that might speak to the point Krista had made earlier too about things that sort of remain present or primal to us, right? That when he's talking about physical experiences, I think there's a way that we can hook into that, right? Whether it's, picking up that grasshopper in Two-Hearted River, or being hot, or walking, or being tired, or being drunk, that those physical states are so central here to his descriptions, but in ways that allow us to kind of project our own experiences of some of those things in as well.
That story too, that skiing story, is really interesting from the point of view of this discussion of domesticity, because it's Nick who's expecting the baby, and he's happy and excited about it, but his friend perceives it. His friend is Bill again, right? His friend perceives like, oh gosh, we'll never have any fun anymore because you're going to go be a dad. This is just tragic to me. And Nick is like, it's not tragic at all. It's really kind of exciting. Yeah. So there's a lot of courage, I think. Hemingway, people think Hemingway is so man's man, and he is. And there's some things I, can go on about, like, Lieutenant Henry swimming underwater for a mile in A Farewell to Arms, and then coming up and knowing what tributary of what Italian river he's in. But, like, men never ask directions, they don't have to. But there's also some really surprisingly candid and tender and warm moments about parenthood in this book that I find just very touching, actually.
Mhm.
Let me ask before we go, another scene I had, at first I had mixed emotions about, but the one where he told his mother he didn't love her.
Uh-huh.
And then I first thought, okay, he's from the war, you know, and no, wait a minute. I didn't know what to think about that scene. What a terrible thing to say. And yet what a terrible situation he's been through. I didn't know what Hemingway wanted us to think there, or if think anything.
Well, I mean, right, doesn't he tell, this is Krebs, and she says, do you love me? And he says, no, but then he says, I don't love anybody.
Yeah.
Right? Like I think that the degree to which he seems to be really struggling, right? And that his little sister is the only one who, in some ways it feels like his little sister's the only one that gets him, or he feels like she's the only one that gets him.
Yeah. I just found that, I mean, no matter how bad he feels, he can't tell his mother that. That's what I would, you know, and yet, okay.
Well, and he tries to make it up, right? Doesn't
Yes,
he say, like, I didn't mean it. I just was,
didn't mean it.
yeah. So I think not to commit the sin of the Hemingway documentary, but I think if you are particularly interested in the kind of linked short stories and these kinds of ruminations too, I can't recommend Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried enough as a book that I think is really clearly in conversation with in our time, as you know, both in terms of writing about war. The things they carried is about the Vietnam War, but in terms too of thinking about love and death and grief and how we carry on. So I'll just end by pointing you all both towards other work by Hemingway, but also toward Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried as a place to continue the conversation.
I'll second that. I had to read The Things They Carried for school. So, and I still remember that. So,
yeah.
I don't know who wrote this because I didn't look it up, but there's a biography of Hadley Richardson, Hemingway's first wife and his wife at the time of this book. And it's very, very good, because if you want to hear the other side of that story, it's really worth reading. And there's a fictionalized biography of her called The First Wife. But unfortunately, I read the biography before I read the fictionalized one. So I felt like I could just see where the author of the fiction had just lifted passages out of the real biography. So I prefer the real biography, but your mileage may vary.
Pat Donaldson put out a book a couple of years ago about like responding to the Paris wife too, telling that story from a Hemingway biographer's perspective, which is interesting.
all right. Well,
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
All three of you.
Yeah,
thank you very
all
much
for coming.
Yeah. All right.
Thanks,
Well,
everyone.
It was good to have you. And yeah, thank you. I'll go ahead and end the meeting now if everybody is done. So.